First of all, Claire, Claire, go ahead. We can record this. Let's record.
Okay.
Collins, tell me about why you should get the book.
Okay, I thought of 3 reasons. I read the chapter on Persian Gulf security tonight. For one thing, and I mention this every time, the maps. The maps are fabulous. Another thing is it presents a very nuanced discussion, and you know, you may think that you understand about who's a Sunni and who's a Shia. There's different grades of everything, and you can use this book as a reference. I think of books as canned knowledge. You read it, you may forget about it, you put it on a shelf, and you want to find out, you know, what was that I learned, and you go back to it. So this is canned knowledge, and you can go back to it. And another thing is, I learned a new word. I collect things for my vocabulary, even at my advanced age. Littoral, L-I-T-T-O-R-A-L, and it means coastal. And it refers to the countries that border the Persian Gulf. And of course, there are other countries that are affected, but there's only a certain number of them that are bordering, and so they are littoral. And so anyway, you'll learn more about that when we have our speaker.
Okay. And Dr. Atlas is going to fill in the blanks with that one. And now,
Yes.
and now we will start. Diane, if you would introduce our speaker.
Okay, thank you, Betty.
Yep.
Pierre M. Atlas is a professor of political science at Marian University, and from 2003 to 2020 served as the founding director of the Richard G. Lugar Franciscan Center for Global Studies. He writes a monthly opinion column for the Indianapolis Business Journal, and prior to that was an opinion columnist for the Indianapolis Star for 16 years. He obtained his Ph.D. in political science from Rutgers University and holds master's and bachelor's degrees in political science from the University of Arizona and the University of Toronto, respectively. He teaches courses in American foreign policy, Middle East politics, global perspectives, terrorism, and homeland security, among other things. A comparative political scientist by training, Pierre devoted much of his academic career to studying and writing about the Middle East. He has written articles and book reviews and presented numerous conference papers on Middle East politics. He is author of U.S. Foreign Policy in the Arab Spring, Balancing Values and Interests, and has authored entries for the Encyclopedia of the Modern Middle East and North Africa, and the Encyclopedia of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. More recently, his research and peer-reviewed publications have examined how the legacy of the North American frontier helps to explain contemporary political differences between the U.S. and Canada on issues such as indigenous policy, the role of government, gun laws, and gun culture. A native of Texas, Pierre grew up in California and is an Army veteran. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pierre Atlas.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. It's much longer than I thought. Sorry about that. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So I'm going to show my PowerPoint. Here we go. Share. Okay. Okay, very good. So you guys can see it? Okay. All right. So let me move this out of the way. Okay. I'm just going to adjust something on my screen so I can see what I want to do. So first of all, let me go ahead and say that I also agree it's a Great Decisions book is something worth getting. I look forward to it every year. And in fact, some of the articles in the various issues I have used in my classroom and in different classes, and I still use them because they're very up to date and they're very well written, including the one tonight by Lawrence Potter. And for those of you who have the book, hopefully you've read the chapter on the Persian Gulf, which I will be referring to. I'll be using definitely as a source for what I have to say, as well as other things too. So let's get started. Let me point out first of all that I was looking back, and this is actually the 16th year that I've given a talk for ICWA for the Great Decisions Program. I've done one every year, and that actually led me to an interesting observation that I'm going to share with you in a minute. So tonight, what I want to do is there are several topics I want to cover. First, I'll look at major players and regional dynamics in the Persian Gulf. I'll sort of do an overview of U.S. foreign policy in the Persian Gulf over time, and end with just sort of a list of what we call non-traditional security issues, because we always tend to focus on oil and security and war and military type things and all that, and tensions. But there's also in international relations an area called non-traditional security. I'll talk about that. And then we'll end with the Great Decisions discussion questions, question and answer, conversation, all that kind of stuff. But first, what I want to do is I want to take a look at Great Decisions then and now. So I was going through previous Great Decisions talks that I gave, and it turns out that in 2010, the topic of the talk was the U.S. and the Persian Gulf. And so I thought that was really interesting. This is 2010. We're talking before the Arab Spring, before the rise of ISIS, a lot of other kinds of things, before the nuclear deal with Iran, all these types of things. But this was the topic, and I couldn't find the book, so I don't know actually who wrote it. It might have been Lawrence Potter, I'm not sure. But what I did find that I thought was really interesting was, at the end of every chapter in the Great Decisions book, there's always a list of discussion questions. And I looked at the discussion questions, and these were the discussion questions from 2010, from 11 years ago. Should the U.S. withdraw from Iraq at the end of 2011, even if that might lead to greater instability and violence in the country? How should the U.S. deal with Iran if it continues to defy international community on its nuclear program? Should the Obama administration make domestic reform and democratization primary issues in the Saudi-U.S. relationship, or avoid such issues? How should the U.S. respond to election results in Iraq that were taking place at the time? To what extent should the U.S. prioritize resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a way to help achieve American goals in the Persian Gulf region? And then, should women's rights play a role in U.S. bilateral relations with Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia? These were the discussion questions at the end of the 2010 Great Decisions talk in the book on the U.S. and the Persian Gulf. So what I found really interesting was comparing those questions to the questions that are at the end of this chapter and seeing what are the similarities and differences. What interest does the U.S. have in the Persian Gulf? How can we best be realized? If the U.S. reduces its footprint in the Gulf, is it realistic to expect other countries to step up and guarantee Gulf security? What do you believe is the best policy towards U.S. bases in the Gulf? Leave them as is, bring the troops home, or move to an over-the-horizon role? What is the downside for the U.S. continuing to maintain bases there? What is the significance of the new normalization agreements between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain? What are the reasons that the Gulf is in such an insecure region? Why are the regional states so suspicious of each other? And then finally, many experts believe that canceling the Iran nuclear deal and reimposition of sanctions was a bad idea. What do you think? Should the U.S. insist on changes if the deal is renegotiated? I'm going to end the talk at the very end by restating these questions so we can have a discussion. What I found really interesting was looking at the questions from 2010 and 2021 is there's sort of a back to the future element. There's certain themes that are still there. We're still asking some of the same basic questions. So what I kind of wanted to do is lay out very quickly what's changed and what hasn't changed. Well, certain things. Okay, first of all, we no longer have a large military footprint in Iraq. The Palestinian issue is no longer on the front burner. Israel has normalized relations to various extents with 4 additional Arab states, including 2 in the Gulf, UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, just in the last year or so. On the other hand, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or Israeli relations with the Gulf was an issue then, and it's an issue now as well. Great Decisions 2021 does not raise, interestingly enough, does not raise democratization or human rights concerns in the questions, whereas it did it in 2010 before the Arab Spring. So after 11 years, basically 10 years since the Arab Spring, with all of the civil wars that have taken place, I find it kind of interesting that human rights, gender equality, those types of questions that actually were part of the Arab Spring itself were not being asked in 2021. We can talk about that maybe later if you're interested. The Saudi-Iranian Cold War has become hot on occasion. Unlike in the 2010, it's much more so now. but there's still tensions, obviously. We had recently the Iranian drone strikes against Saudi sites, the airport, oil refineries, things like that. And they are on different sides in the Yemen civil war and also the Syrian civil war, two civil wars that broke out after the Arab Spring in 2011. So these are some things that have changed. What hasn't changed? Well, there's still concern about Iran's potential to develop and acquire nuclear weapons. In 2010, it was before the creation of the Iran deal. Now it's after the US withdrawal from the Iran deal. Saudi-Iranian tensions and balance of power politics, that's still there. One of the big questions that was driving the questions in 2010 was, again, what are America's interests in the region? Or as the Clash said in their great classic song, should I stay or should I go? If the US withdraws militarily from the region, will that be detrimental to US interests? We are still asking this question 12 years later. Regional instability continues, but I will say with new scripts. So these actually have changed, but still we're talking about regional instability. In 2010, it was before the US withdrawal from Iraq, before the creation of ISIS, before the Arab Spring. Now we're looking at ISIS is defeated on the ground. It still poses threats, but not nowhere near as what it did before. Now we have civil wars in Yemen and Syria. Also, the one in Libya has stalled, but there was a civil war there as well, with Saudis as an active combatant in Yemen, and Iran with the Revolutionary Guard Corps actively involved on the ground in Syria. So one of the interesting things is that both Saudi Arabia and Iran, Saudi Arabia and Iran are both active combatants in civil wars in other countries. And in those civil wars, the other party is on the other side of those conflicts. And these are some of the things. So the tensions are still there, but we have some changes. So I just want to sort of bring that up. I think it's kind of interesting to look at. We are sort of dealing with some of the same questions, even though the details have changed a little bit. So what I want to go through now is major players and regional dynamics first. And one of the things that Lawrence Potter talks about in the reading is the price of oil and how important that is. If it drops below $40 a barrel, it actually raises very serious stability issues for some of the countries that depend on oil. I checked today on Bloomberg, and West Texas is about $64 a barrel. Brent is about $67 a barrel. So that's the price right now. So it's definitely higher than it was when, frankly, when Lawrence Potter wrote the chapter. But then he does say this, he makes this point that I think is important. The long-term outlook for oil revenues is not good as the world transitions away from its dependency on petroleum. We care about the Persian Gulf because of oil. It's just that simple. And the price of oil, the strategic significance of oil, the fact that even as the United States is weaning its way off of dependence on foreign oil because of fracking and other kinds of things, and most of the oil we import to the United States now comes from Canada and Mexico, not from the Middle East. All that said, the global economy is still largely petroleum based. Aircraft, ships, container ships carrying all of the goods across the Pacific, globalization is largely driven by oil. So the price of oil, access to oil, is still a vital interest to the United States and to major powers in the world and to the region, even as we are trying to move away from oil. This is just something we have to sort of keep in mind as we move forward. The region we're talking about, the red circle is what we're talking about, the Persian Gulf area and the littoral states, as was mentioned. And then we have all of the countries that border the Persian Gulf are within that red circle that I put there. Here we have some closer up pictures here. Again, you can see where is the Persian Gulf. This top picture, by the way, is it was mentioned how nice the maps are in the Great Decisions book. This actually is a map from last year's Great Decision book. I did a talk on the Red Sea. Now it's the Persian Gulf. So here's the Red Sea over here. Here's the Persian Gulf. And then with the Persian Gulf, its narrowest point, the choke point, is the Straits of Hormuz, which I've circled here. And between the Iranian side and the Omanian side at the bottom of the Persian Gulf, it's only 34 miles wide. So this choke point can become of tremendous strategic significance as you're thinking about the transfer of oil going through the Persian Gulf. Approximately 20% of the entire world's oil production travels through the Persian Gulf on tankers every day. So this is one of the reasons why we care regardless of, from the United States perspective, why are we paying attention more to the Persian Gulf than we are to other parts of the world? Largely, it's because of that. Obviously, there's a lot of culture and politics and people and tremendous other issues as well. But oil is a major factor that we really have to take into account. As long as oil is important, we're going to be paying attention to it. Now, what I did here was I wanted to give you a sense of these states, the Persian Gulf states or the littoral states. And so what I did was a basic CIA World Factbook source. I went ahead and I got I put down the population of each country and its per capita GDP. And it's what we call real per capita GDP or purchasing power parity GDP. So the numbers might seem a little bit higher, especially in the United States, but it's actually a more accurate reflection of what the money buys in those countries. To give you just as a baseline comparison, the United States per capita GDP in 2019 was $62,530. So as you're looking at other countries, we can sort of compare it. So Saudi Arabia, about 34.8 million people, 38% of the population of the 34 million people, 38% are non-Saudis, foreign workers working in Saudi Arabia with per capita GDP of $46,900. That's still a very wealthy country. Iran, with 88.9 million people, per capita GDP of only 12,400. Iraq with 36.9 million, 10,900 GDP. Kuwait, 4.4 million, 70% of the population are non-Kuwaitis, foreign workers living and working in Kuwait, almost $50,000 per capita GDP. Bahrain, 1.5 million, 45,000 GDP. Qatar, 2.5 million with a $90,000 per capita GDP. UAE, 9.8 million, 88% of the population of the United Arab Emirates are foreign born with a per capita GDP of 67,000. Again, that's higher than the United States. And then Oman with 3.7 million, 46% are non-Omani, $27,300 per capita. I put this here just to give you a sense of the countries we're talking about, just some basic facts. I think it's useful to have. Obviously, the major countries in terms of population are Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq. Together, they account for maybe 85% of the population of the Persian Gulf. A lot of these other countries, which we call the Gulf states, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, and Oman, very small populations, fairly high, with the exception of Oman, fairly high per capita GDP. Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and UAE are very oil rich, although they're diversifying their economies. But this gives you a sort of an economic snapshot of the region. And again, the significance is obviously oil is a very important thing. And one reason why the per capita GDP is so much higher in some of these countries is because of oil revenue. Another way of looking at these countries is the freedom scores. Some of you may be familiar with Freedom House's Freedom in the World survey. It's freedomhouse.org. It's a really good site. And basically what they do is they do very detailed reports on every country in the world, and they rank them as free, partly free, or not free on a score of 100. And if you go to the website, you can get very detailed country reports for each year. They go back several, they've been doing this since the 1970s, actually. And you can get a lot of good information about it. I just wanted to give you sort of a snapshot of the countries, because frankly, the countries that are both in the Persian Gulf, the countries that are both American allies and America's adversary, Iran, every single one of them, with the exception of Kuwait, is rated as not free by Freedom House. And you can see the scores here. The least free, and again, the closer you get to 100 is the freest possible. 7 out of 100 for Saudi Arabia, that's pretty low. Kuwait is partly free at 37. That's the only country in the Gulf region that is ranked as partly free. Other Middle Eastern countries, the only 2 countries in the entire Middle East and North Africa, according to Freedom House, that are ranked as free, are Israel and Tunisia. Tunisia is the one country, that's where the Arab Spring began. It's where it is a country that has actually made a successful transition to democracy. All of the other countries that were impacted by the Arab Spring, pretty much every single one of them is worse off in some ways than they were before, or certainly not better off. And they certainly have not had a transition to democracy. Some have erupted into extreme violence like Syria or Libya. Some you had a very, very harsh government crackdown and shut down any possibility of dissent, like Bahrain, these kinds of things. But if you look at it, the only other, basically we have the only 2 countries in the Middle East and North Africa that are ranked as partly free are Kuwait and Lebanon. Every other country in the Middle East is ranked as not free, with the exceptions of Israel and Tunisia. And this sort of gives you a sense. Now, to put things in perspective, the United States is ranked as free with a score of 83. So Israel gets a 76, Tunisia gets a 71. Canada is ranked as free with a score of 98. And by the way, the American score went down. In 2019, we scored an 86. And this year we went down to an 83. The quality of American democracy is going down as ranked by Freedom House. They have very detailed reports if you're interested in doing that. Russia not free at 20, China not free at 9. Of all the states I have listed up here, the least free with the lowest score possible is Saudi Arabia, which is of course one of America's strongest allies in the region. And so this is kind of an interesting, just again, I want to sort of give you the sense, we talk about it if you want later on, but it's sort of like a scorecard of who the players are based on per capita income, per capita GDP, political rankings of freedom, and population. So you just get a sense of who the players are. Okay. When we're looking at the region, there are alliances and there are rivalries. I want to go through just a couple of countries real quick here. Iran, and I'm drawing a good amount from the book that you read for today, the chapter. U.S. economic sanctions imposed by President Trump, as he puts it, the author puts it, have drastically reduced oil exports and therefore government income. When the United States withdrew from JICPOA, which is the Iran nuclear deal in 2017, it dashed hopes for a better future for Iranians and reinforced the role of the hardliners running the state. I want to really underscore that point is that when the deal was reached in 2015 between Iran and the P5+1, the permanent five. So you had, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, the United States, Britain, France, Russia, and China, plus Germany, all negotiated with Iran. So it was actually a 7-party deal. This was not a bilateral agreement. You had all these countries coming together, very, very detailed negotiations on the nuclear deal. When that happened, not only was it controversial in the United States, it was also controversial in Iran. The Iranian hardliners did not support the agreement. They thought Iran was giving up too much. They did not want the Iranians to basically agree to stop enriching their uranium for the possibility of getting nuclear weapons. And when the United States pulled out, it actually played into the hands of the Iranian hardliners who were against the deal in the first place. And they can say, aha, see, we can't even trust the United States. So anytime the United States takes harsh action against Iran, the hardliners benefit because that's what they want. And so this is something to sort of keep in mind. And of course, with the Yemen civil war, which we maybe touch on a little bit in this class, in this talk, it's not really addressed too much in the book. But with the Yemen civil war, the Houthis were not, they're Shiites, but they're a different type of Shiite than the Iranian Shiites. But they were sort of forced into the Iranian camp because the Saudis were attacking them in part of the civil war. The Houthis did not necessarily want to be aligned with Iran, but you're sort of given a choice of, what you're either for us or you're against us. And Iran is sort of lending support to the Houthis in the civil war. Saudi Arabia, you'll see I abbreviated as KSA. That's Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. That's the abbreviation for Saudi Arabia. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS. He's a reformer at home. He's doing actually some interesting reforms that are in some ways leading to some political and social liberalization inside Saudi Arabia. He's cracking down on a lot of corruption, but he's also using the corruption crackdowns to enhance his own power. So he's consolidating his own power very largely. He's waiting to become king. But as Lawrence Potter puts it in the reading, he has been aggressive and reckless in foreign policy. He has really upped the role of Saudi Arabia in the Yemen civil war. The death count in the Yemen civil war, depending on who you look at, it's upwards of 200,000 potentially. It's the worst humanitarian disaster in the world right now. And the Saudis are largely a major player, bombing civilians right and left with American and British munitions. And so it's been a very brutal war that they've been waging in Yemen. Of course, as the American intelligence community has recently announced just a few days ago, actually, we believe that Mohammed bin Salman is directly responsible for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post reporter who was murdered and butchered. American intelligence believes that it was done under MBS's direct orders. So these are sort of, and again, this is the country that scored the lowest by Freedom House. In addition to Iran and Saudi Arabia, we'll talk about that a little bit more as I move on. There are also a lot of other regional players. There's a lot of political and strategic tensions that are going on between them. On one hand, and I want to say that it's not black and white, and it's not completely fixed. It's not written in stone, but Qatar is on one side of a sort of tensions with Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt on the other side. And it goes back to the Arab Spring in 2011, when they took different sides on what was happening in the Arab Spring and different sides on what was happening in Egypt in particular. When Mubarak was being overthrown, and then the Muslim Brotherhood came into power, Qatar was very strongly supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood, whereas Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain were very much opposed to it. And then the post-Arab Spring, post-Muslim Brotherhood Egypt is on the same side with these other countries. Qatar is in some ways sort of aligning with Iran in some ways, even though it's an Arab state, and Iran is not. But you have this kind of tension that goes on. They also took different sides in the Libyan civil war. They were supporting different factions. And Qatar is now sort of shifting its direction more towards Iran and also Turkey. Iran and Turkey have their own rivalry, but when it comes to dealing with other countries in the region, sometimes they find themselves kind of on the same side. So again, it's sort of like a deck of cards. You can reshuffle them multiple times. But it used to be that what was called the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which was Saudi Arabia plus the Arab Gulf states, were pretty much in alliance. And they even tried to develop a common foreign policy, and they tried to develop a common defense policy. The Arab Spring really sort of blew that up, with different countries taking different sides in the Arab Spring. What's interesting now is we could see developing sort of de facto regional alliances and even sort of an old-fashioned balance of power, with Iran, Turkey, and Qatar on one side, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, and Israel on the other. And I'll talk about Israel a little bit later, but Israel is definitely a player. It's normalizing relations with both Bahrain and UAE. It has been working under the radar with the Saudis for a very long time, because all these countries see Iran as a common foe, especially the other Persian Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, see Iran as a common foe. Egypt and Turkey are very much at loggerheads, and Israel and Turkey are also at loggerheads. So Israel and Egypt are sort of on the same side in that dynamic. There's a lot of, I won't bring it in here in detail, but Greece is also playing a role here as well. Egypt, Greece, and Israel have been doing some joint maneuvers and cooperation with each other in the Eastern Mediterranean to counter Turkey. France is starting to play a role there as well to counter Turkey. And so you have all sorts of, kind of like a 19th century great game, balance of power that's taking place in the Persian Gulf and beyond with all of these different players. It's pretty interesting, and it's shifting a lot depending on the particular issues. There are also major outside powers, and Lawrence Potter talks about this. China is very active in the Persian Gulf, but not in a military way. It is the single largest purchaser of Persian Gulf oil, especially from Iran. China has a very good relationship with Iran, and is really interested in oil. That's its main interest in the Middle East is access to natural resources. As you may be familiar, and you certainly from the reading of the chapter, their Belt and Road Initiative, which is probably the largest global infrastructure project, in centuries. The Chinese are all over the world, linking Asia to Africa to the Middle East, all sorts of places that are building massive sets of ports and roads and connections to basically extract natural resources and to increase China's economic and therefore political influence around the world with mutual benefit. So the Belt and Road Initiative has been impacting the region as well. A major port in Gwadar, Pakistan, in the Indian Ocean, actually is one of the largest ports in the world, and it's largely have been built by the Chinese to help Pakistan, and Pakistan and China also both see India as a rival and potential threat. So there's a logic to that, and as long as China has large port access, that also means they have access for their Navy to do ports of call if they ever want to really have a global Navy. So they're laying things down in a certain way. They're also working with Qatar in Duqm to build another port. They have a military base in Djibouti, actually more than one, on the Red Sea. And as Potter points out in the reading, there are hundreds of Chinese companies actually have corporate headquarters in Dubai. And so you have a really strong presence. But what's kind of important to understand is that China has shown no interest whatsoever in taking on a major strategic role of policing the Gulf or sending its Navy there, or doing anything like that. They do not want to take over America's security role in the Gulf. As Potter himself puts it, the Chinese want to do business. They don't want to be fighting wars. And I think that's a good way of putting it. Actually, I think he quotes somebody else as saying that, but that's in the reading. Russia wants to keep oil prices high. Russia is a major oil exporter. And Russia and Saudi Arabia have both cooperated in the past and had tensions in the past over oil prices. You may be familiar with that, but that's one of the major focuses for Russia is oil. They support the Assad regime in Syria, as you know. They've been on the ground in Syria supporting the regime. They have anti-aircraft batteries there, fighters, things like that. But Russia also has signaled it's not interested in taking over any kind of U.S. security role if the U.S. were to pull out. Nobody really wants to do that. They would rather just have their own particular interests. Also, the American, and we'll talk about this later on when I get into American policy in the region, but the U.S. Presence in the Gulf is incredibly expensive, and Russia, China, they don't want to be spending their money there. They don't have the interest in sort of taking over American security roles there. And they may not necessarily like to see America there, but they don't want to replace the United States. And I think that's pretty clear in terms of replacing them entirely. Does Russia want to have influence? Absolutely. Does Russia want to maybe undermine America's influence or legitimacy in the region to the extent that they can? Absolutely. But do they want to replace the United States? Probably not. Now, what's interesting is to update this today. Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia has arrived in the Gulf, and he's going to do a 4-day visit, and he's visiting Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. He is not going to Jerusalem, Israel. He's not going to Istanbul or Ankara, Turkey. He's not going to visit those countries, but he's visiting specifically these countries to sort of shore up Russian relations. And this is an interesting thing that basically what's been happening, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later when I get to the normalization agreements with Israel. But I'm going to argue that with particularly the foreign policy of the Trump administration, and even before that, a little bit with Obama, but especially with Trump's America First withdrawal kind of isolationist policy, he sort of created certain vacuums that other countries could fill. Not just to step in place of the United States, but a lot of the local actors came to understand that maybe we need to start looking for other partners. Maybe we need to start talking to the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians and others, because can we really rely on the United States completely? And so the idea that the Russian foreign minister going to UAE and Saudi Arabia, which are pretty much kind of American allies, not a problem. Saudi Arabia wants to keep its options open. Actually, Israel has very, very positive relations with Russia. Putin and Netanyahu get along very well personally. And so even Israel is sort of playing this. As the United States sort of shrunk back, it opened the opportunity for other countries. We are moving, to bring in some international relations concepts, we are moving really from what we might have called the unipolar or hegemonic situation where the United States was the sole superpower, maybe post-Cold War, to really we're sort of moving, we already are in a multipolar world. We're getting closer and closer to sort of the 19th century balance of power era, where there are lots of different major powers, and they're playing different roles. They're having flexible alliances, or not even alliances. They're trying to get in good relations with lots of different countries to pursue their interests. And we're starting to see a lot of that happening now. And this is sort of the atmosphere that Biden is coming into, and we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. One of the things I find really interesting in the reading for today is that one of the persons that is quoted is former Ambassador William Burns. And Burns actually is Biden's choice to become CIA director. So what he says here, and this was he was quoted in the article. I think he'd given an interview. He's quoted in the article before Biden had picked him for CIA director. So what he says actually carries a lot more weight. He's not just a former State Department long-term diplomat. He's actually going to most likely become head of the CIA. So I think what he's saying is actually kind of important. I'm going to quote him a couple of times tonight. But he said here, we ought to be mindful of external competitors such as Russia and China, but not be unnerved by them. They are not really trying to replace us. They're not trying to, we're not going to have a military conflict with them in the region or in the Persian Gulf, but they're there for their economic and security interests, and they want to make allies and things like that. So we have to be careful about them, but don't lose too much sleep over it, I think is what he's saying. And we're going to, I'll bring in a little bit more from Burns later. India is another major power. Before COVID hit, 8.5 million Indians worked in the Gulf and were sending their money home in remittances, primarily in Saudi Arabia and UAE. India has good relations with Iran and is helping Iran build a port, in part to counter China and Pakistan. And so you have, here you have China has built this huge port with Pakistan. They're doing another one with Qatar, India, and UAE. Excuse me. I mean, yeah, and then India is doing it with Iran. And so they're trying to, India wants to make sure it has good relations in the region as well, because they want to sort of counter both China and Pakistan's influence, these kinds of things. But as Potter puts it again, India also does not have any interest in playing a major security role in the Middle East. It is there really for what they can get out of the situation, but they do not. Nobody really wants to take over the American role in the region. Let me just sort of give you a couple of brief maps here before I move on to American foreign policy. It's the Saudi-Iranian Cold War and the Sunni Shia divide are mentioned in the reading, and I kind of want to just give you this image. What we're talking about. We could argue that the Sunni Shia divide is sort of overblown in the sense that not everybody thinks just in terms of that particular identity. They also have national identities. They have other things that people care about. It isn't just Sunni Shia. But that being said, the Saudis in particular are very concerned about Shia Islam and very concerned about Iran's influence among Shia populations in other countries. So this map, which is a very interesting map, I think it's very useful. Oops. We have, I don't like that. We have the dark green, the solid green are countries with a Shiite majority. So the countries in the region that have where the majority of the people are Shiite are Iran, which is largely Persian, Iraq, which is largely Arab, and Bahrain is a majority. Okay, and then you have, and then potentially Lebanon. Although Lebanon hasn't had a census since 1932, but people believe that the Shiites in Lebanon are either at least the plurality, if not the majority of the population. And then on the map, you see some green countries that have stripes. The striped green countries are countries with large Shiite minorities. And you will notice that Kuwait, Bahrain, and even part of Saudi Arabia has a large Shiite minority. And the Shiite minority in Saudi Arabia happens to be in an area where a lot of the oil fields are located. So Saudi Arabia has always been very, very concerned about its Shiite minority, which the Saudi regime is very repressive towards. They seriously mistreat it. When there was the Arab Spring hit Bahrain around 2011, 2012, initially it was a national movement to take on the royal family, which was very non-democratic. And you had Shiites and Sunnis together. But the Saudis sort of came in and basically forced and encouraged the Bahraini government to split the Shiites away from the Sunnis. They started giving privileges to the Sunnis and imprisoning the Shiites, firing the Shiites from their jobs, things like that. And they basically reconstructed the tensions from the people rising up against an authoritarian monarchy to they made it into a Shiite versus Sunni conflict. Which sort of forced even the Bahrainis who were not happy with their government, they sort of relied on their Sunni identity instead of the Shiites. And then the Saudis sent in troops into Bahrain. They put it down. The United States supported this under Obama because we were very concerned about the Fifth Fleet, which I'll talk about in a minute. Whereas the United States was encouraging Mubarak to step down in the Arab Spring. In Bahrain, we supported the Saudis and the Bahrainis cracking down on the democracy movement. Because frankly, in that country, and I wrote about this in an academic article, in that country, the American concern were our national security interests and the fleet that was headquartered there, and not democracy in Bahrain. Whereas in Egypt, we were much more willing to sort of follow our values and support sort of American idealism and encourage Mubarak to step down after 18 days of the public protest. These are some of the kinds of things that were happening. Maybe it's too much information, but again, it sort of gives you this idea from the Saudi perspective, from some other Sunni Arab countries. The concern was Iran's influence with the Shiite population. Are they trying to undermine the legitimacy of Sunni governments that have large Shiite populations? And the term Shiite crescent, I believe, was coined by King Abdullah II of Jordan. I believe he's the one who came up with the term, suggesting there's a crescent from Iran all the way to Lebanon. And of course, you can see down Yemen has a very large Shiite minority as well, and that's part of what's driving. There's many more things that are going on within the Yemeni civil war than that, but it is one part is sort of this ethnic, religious ethnic divide as well. Anyway, so this is sort of what's going on. At least you have a general sense of it. Also, you can see India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan also have Shiite minorities, as does Turkey. Azerbaijan, which is technically not in the Middle East, is majority Shiite as well. So these are different, and not all Shiites think the same. The Shiites in Iran are 12er Shiites. The Shiites in Yemen, the Houthis, I believe, are 5ers. And so it's a different kind of a different interpretation of Shia Islam as well. In addition to this, I just want to sort of put some facts out there. So in the immediate region of the Persian Gulf area, there have been 3 major wars over the past few decades. The Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, which was the bloodiest war in the modern Middle East. Over 1 million people died in this war. Interstate war between states. And about 500,000 people died on each side. The Gulf War, which you're familiar with, and then the Iraq War. These were 3 major wars, 2 of which the United States was a combatant in it, all of which were centered around the Persian Gulf. And then post-Arab Spring, we've had several civil wars, most notably in Syria, Libya, and Yemen. This sort of gives you a sense of more from a conflict perspective on what's going on. Last map before I get into American policy. This is actually sort of the relationship between the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. And on the left-hand side, we see basically these are Saudi pipelines. So the Saudis are shipping oil not just through the Persian Gulf, but also through the Red Sea, which I spoke about last year for Great Decisions. And the Red Sea it has its own strategic significance. You can see a lot of pipelines that are actually taking oil across that way. And then also the Red Sea itself, Djibouti is right here at the bottom. And we have the Gulf of Aden, another choke point as the Red Sea becomes more important. And you will see all these different countries have some type of base, either military base or commercial ports. Japan, China, the United States, Russia, all have presences in Djibouti, which is a tiny little country, or in the immediate area. So potential for tensions are definitely high. So this is all part of the reality. One final thing, since I have this map available, let me just tell you. So with the normalization agreement between the United Arab Emirates and Israel, one of the things that's actually has started is UAE is delivering oil to Israel via tanker through the Red Sea to the port of Eilat. And then Israel's going to be building a pipeline to take it further into Israel. This is the first time that a Persian Gulf Arab state, as far as I can recall, I've been thinking about this. It's the first time that a Persian Gulf Arab state has ever delivered oil to Israel in the history of modern Israel. Before the Shah of Iran was overthrown, Iran was the major oil exporter to Israel. So Israel got most of its oil from Iran. But no Gulf Arab state in the Persian Gulf was supplying Israel because they were all in a hostile position to Israel. With the normalization agreement, UAE is now supplying oil to Israel, which is really in itself, that's quite a major change. All right. Okay. So let me, the next major thing I want to cover, and I'm keeping an eye on the time here, is U.S. policy in the Persian Gulf specifically, as opposed to the actors themselves. Let me just hit a couple of things real quick. Potter talks about this briefly. The Persian Gulf becomes of global strategic significance in the late 19th century. Really, when the world starts transitioning, he doesn't mention this part, when the world starts transitioning from coal to oil, especially the navies, especially the Royal Navy, the British Navy. This is when the Persian Gulf becomes very important. Both Iran, where oil is discovered, then later Arabia, and then other places, Kuwait, the various states that are become protectorates of Great Britain until 1971. What we call Pax Britannica, the British were the major maritime power and the major balancer in the Persian Gulf from the 1830s, before even oil became an issue, until 1971, when Britain pulls out. It is at this time, in 1971, when Britain pulls out, that the United States steps in and takes over the role of Great Britain as the major power, as the major global power in the region. And this is where I want to start with looking at foreign policy. So in the 1970s, we have what's called the Nixon Doctrine. And at this point, the United States took the position that the US would remain over the horizon, not in the region itself, okay, over the horizon. And we relied on proxies to patrol the Gulf and to make sure the flow of oil went smoothly. And we had two allies at the time. We had the Shah of Iran and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and the Shah, they had potential like little rivalries over islands and or little kinds of rivalries and stuff. But they basically were both pro-Western, pro-British, pro-American allies. And they were known as the twin pillars. And this was the twin pillars of America's Middle East strategy in the Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabia and the Shah's Iran. In fact, the Shah was actually known as the policeman of the Gulf. The United States supplied the Shah with the latest weaponry. We had major CIA stations based in Iran to monitor the Soviet Union, all these kinds of things. This was a Cold War type thing. Meanwhile, we were in Vietnam. We didn't want to be getting involved in the Gulf. We didn't need to. We armed and trained the Saudis with a small population and Iran with a very large population, and we relied predominantly on Iran, which of course led to a lot of the fueled a lot of the resentment of Iranians against the United States. In January 1980, shortly after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, and then immediately after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which took place right around Christmas 1979, President Carter gave a speech on television, and he declared that the Persian Gulf was, quote, a vital interest of the United States. The idea that the Iranian Revolution, hostile to the United States, was now on one side of the Persian Gulf. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, and no one knew, especially when these were very serious, legitimate concerns at the time. This is when Carter declares the Persian Gulf is a vital interest of the United States. And he says the United States will use military force to defend it if necessary. It is at this time that Carter reinstitutes the registration for the draft. So from this point forward, every male over 18, when they're 18, has to register for the draft. It comes out of this moment. To date myself, this is the year I graduated from high school. This is when I was turning 18. And I was in the first year of people to register for the draft. I did it at the University of Toronto as a student. But when I was in high school, graduating in 1980, I actually had, I still have it, my high school yearbook, one of my friends signed it, "See you in Afghanistan," as a half joke, because we're talking June 1980, and we still don't know, are the Soviets going to go? What's going to happen? Are we going to end up going into a war with the Soviets in Afghanistan? So as a half joke, he sort of signed that. That sort of captures the era. This becomes known as the Carter Doctrine. The Carter Doctrine, that the Persian Gulf is a vital strategic interest of the United States, and the US is willing to go to war to protect it. This is a radical change from the twin pillars. First of all, we just lost one of the pillars with Iran. Okay. In 1987, during the Iran-Iraq War, and Kuwaiti tankers were being harassed by Iranians, President Reagan implemented the Carter Doctrine. And he sent the US Navy into the Persian Gulf, and we reflagged Kuwaiti tankers, giving them American flags. So they were now American ships. And the US Navy escorted them through the Persian Gulf to make sure the oil would flow smoothly. To make sure, for example, that the Iranians would not try and clog up or sink some ships in the Straits of Hormuz and shut down the Gulf. And of course, this is during the Iran-Iraq War. Both Iran and Iraq are relying on oil revenue to fund their war against each other. This is all in, and the US is sort of there. We have sort of a pox on both their houses policy. We really kind of want to see both countries bleed at the time. And although by the end, we were pretty much on the side of Saddam Hussein against the Iranians. For the first time, the United States, under Carter, starts to build the military capacity to defend the Gulf. Because until this time, until the early 1980s, we had this over-the-horizon policy. We did not have the ability to project power into the Persian Gulf. Carter creates what's called the Rapid Deployment Force. And this eventually becomes Central Command, CENTCOM, which you might be familiar with. This is CENTCOM on the right. And CENTCOM basically covers this very broad footprint. You know, we have Africa Command, we have European Command, all these kind of things. So Central Command, it goes from Egypt all the way to Kazakhstan. I always tell my students, Afghanistan is not part of the Middle East. Afghanistan is Central Asia geographically. But from the US military perspective, Afghanistan, Egypt, Kazakhstan, everything in between is all part of the same area of operation. The Central Command, but geographically, they're not part of the Middle East. But we sort of think of that. That's one reason. I mean, a lot of Americans think of the war in Afghanistan as a Middle Eastern war. Technically, it's not. The picture on the left is actually from 1987, and that's a U.S. Navy vessel escorting a Kuwaiti tanker through the Persian Gulf. So let's carry on with the policy. The Carter Doctrine was put into force again in 1990 when President George H.W. Bush basically, pushes Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. One of the major arguments for why the United States needed to go to war with the United Nations and a very impressive international coalition to push Iraq out of Kuwait was because Saddam invaded Kuwait, annexed Kuwait, and now is sitting on a tremendous amount of the world's oil reserves. And of course, there was the threat that he might go into Saudi Arabia. And again, imagine Saddam Hussein controlling both Saudi oil, Kuwaiti oil, and Iraqi oil. This was untenable for the global economy. It was untenable to have Saddam doing that. So the United States, basically, this was the main thing. This will not stand. And oil was obviously a major factor, not the only factor. There was a lot of other reasons why we went to the Gulf War, but that was a major part of it. After the Gulf War, for the first time, the United States established permanent military basing in Saudi Arabia, largely to enforce the sanctions against Saddam Hussein's Iraq when the war ended. So we had ground troops and we had air force based in Saudi Arabia. This had never been done before. So you think about going from the Nixon Doctrine to the Carter Doctrine. Now we actually have boots on the ground in Saudi Arabia, nowhere near Mecca and Medina, but for pious Saudis and for radical Saudis like Osama bin Laden, this was unacceptable. And it became one of the major grievances that bin Laden cited when he declared war on the United States in 1996 and again in 1998. He declared jihad on the United States. It was his declaration of war. And one of the major things was he said the United States is occupying the land of the two mosques, meaning Mecca and Medina. And the Muslim Holy Land is being occupied by the United States. And this was specifically the aftermath of the Gulf War, with the idea of America wanting to have this physical presence to patrol the Gulf and also to enforce the sanctions against Iraq. Clinton comes in the 1990s and develops a policy known as dual containment. And the idea here was that we have two potential foes in the region. We have Saddam Hussein's Iraq and the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so we're not going to have dual containment. We're going to, the irony is, so under Nixon, we had the twin pillars. We had the two allies, Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now we have the two adversaries, Iran after the revolution and Saddam's Iraq. And so we are going to deter both of them. And so the presence, the physical presence of the United States in the Persian Gulf increases. The Fifth Fleet is sort of recreated. It was an old Fifth Fleet. It's created with a specific mission, and the mission is the Persian Gulf. We never had a fleet before this that was actually its primary, almost sole mission really was to patrol the Persian Gulf. Now we do, and its permanent base, the headquarters of the Fifth Fleet, is in Bahrain, and that was established in 1995. And again, when we jump forward to 2011, 2012, when the Arab Spring hits Bahrain, President Obama does not want to lose or to risk losing access to the Fifth Fleet, to the headquarters. And largely for that reason, we acquiesce to the Saudi and Bahraini royal family and let them put down the peaceful pro-democracy movement, and it gets shut down, which was largely among Shiite Bahrainis. So this is all part of what's going on here. Then, of course, we get September 11th. And after the September 11th, then we get the Iraq War, the removal of Saddam Hussein, which I've argued in the past, and I'm not the only one who says this. Once Saddam Hussein was removed from power, Iran was greatly empowered, because the primary regional check to Iran was Saddam Hussein's Iraq. It had the largest army. It had the best trained army, much better and more efficient than the Saudis. I was in Jordan in 2004 doing some research, and I visited a Jordanian think tank, and I interviewed a retired Jordanian Air Force general who ran this think tank in Amman. And it was at the height of the war. I mean, it was a year after we had invaded. I mean, things were not going well. And he said, and he looked at me and he said, look, Saddam Hussein was a bastard. He killed hundreds of thousands of his own people. But Saddam Hussein was the only deterrent to Iran. And he said that, this is a direct quote. He said, who is going to deter Iran now? Is the United States going to stay in Iraq forever? That's what he said to me in 2004. Obviously, we did not stay in Iraq forever. But what did happen was Iran's power, its influence, its regional influence greatly increased considerably after the overthrow of Saddam. And Iraq itself became much more unstable in many ways. Iran has tremendous political influence in Iraq today through Shia militias and Shia parties, even though Iran is largely Persian and Iraq is largely Arab. You have a lot, and it's much more complicated than that, but Iran definitely is better off in the region after the Iraq war than they were before. We sort of did them a favor. The Arab Spring comes in, keep an eye on the time here. And I said Obama supports Bahrain. I already said that. And then Obama negotiates and signs JCPOA, the Iranian deal, Iranian nuclear deal. This is sort of what happens here. But really what happens with Obama is an interest in pivoting away from the Middle East. War weariness. When Obama was elected, he wanted to get out of Iraq. He wanted to pivot towards Asia, focusing on the challenges posed by China. So the US withdraws from Iraq in 2011 officially, the nuclear deal in 2015. The vacuum created by the withdrawal from Iraq is one of the factors, combined with the Arab Spring turmoil that all starts around 2011, 2012, leads to the rise of ISIS. Trump comes in, Trump with his America First policy, which we want to call America Alone. Like Obama, he also wants to pivot from the region, withdraw the US forces, address China as a strategic and economic threat. As a way of getting out or trying to reduce America's direct footprint in the Middle East, he basically sort of empowers Israel and Saudi Arabia, gives them basically do whatever you want. So recognizes Israeli sovereignty of the Golan Heights, which no American president had ever done since 1967. Unilaterally moves the embassy to Jerusalem, which no president was willing to do up until that point. Gives complete carte blanche to the Saudis to do whatever they want in Yemen. More weapons, the better. When Khashoggi is murdered, Trump covers for him, even though we know for a fact that MBS had ordered the killing. Trump also focused largely on personal relationships, leaders with leaders, and transactional diplomacy rather than either America's strategic interests or American values, I would argue. All right. And then unilaterally withdraws from the Iran deal. Biden comes in, recalibrates. He has just announced that he wants to stop providing Saudi Arabia with offensive weaponry that could be used in Yemen. He wants to renegotiate and possibly re-enter the Iran deal. So let me, in the interest of time, let me just bring this up real quick. And I've just got a couple slides left, and I'll go to questions. So Biden, as I said, William Burns is his choice for CIA director. And there are two really interesting quotes in the reading on page 18 and 28 that I think are interesting here. Basically, he was a former diplomat, but now he is the choice for CIA director. Hang on a second here. Anyway, so he basically is saying we need to shift our terms of engagement in the region, lower our expectations. Basically, he's really talking about how we need to sort of change how we think about the Middle East, be willing to sort of withdraw. Basically, he says here, admits that the Middle East matters less to the US now than it did 30 years ago. He says we need to right-size our ambitions and realign our tools. This means assuring external protection for the Gulf Arabs, but not supporting their meddling in places like Yemen, Libya, and Sudan. That's a quote from the author, not from Burns, but he's sort of paraphrasing what Burns is suggesting. These kinds of things. So basically, Biden wants to recalibrate our position, but I think it's important to understand the history of this and how did we get to where we are today. Quickly, my take on the normalization agreements with Israel. Obviously, Trump and Kushner tried to take a lot of credit for it. They did play a role. However, I actually think that one of the factors that led to the normalization was a negative reaction to Trump's foreign policy in the region. It became very clear that Trump was not willing to stand up and keep the back of our allies, whether it was NATO or Japan or South Korea when he comes into power. And both the Saudis and the Israelis, I think, really got kind of nervous about this. They were already cooperating under Obama because of Iran, and basically it led to much more willingness to cooperate, to share intelligence, things like that. It also leads to two countries that sort of Saudi gives the green light to, Bahrain and UAE, to enter deals with Iran. UAE is hoping to get F-35s in exchange. So there's also a quid pro quo from the Trump administration that says that was part of the deal as well. Sudan was recognized Israel or normalized relations with Israel in exchange for the United States taking Sudan off the terrorism list. These kinds of things that are happening. But I think in some ways the uncertainty and insecurity that was created by Trump's foreign policy brought countries together and made it easier for them to normalize relations with Israel. And I think that that's a major factor that plays a role there. Let me just go real quick again, keeping an eye on the time here. I want to allow for questions. These are what we call non-traditional security issues that we haven't talked about, but these are things that people are very much concerned with. Climate change, pandemics, demographic changes, youth bulbs, environmental pollution, food and water scarcity, irregular migration, human trafficking, drug trafficking, all these sorts of things are all issues that we call non-traditional security, but these are very important things that countries can't cooperate with each other on because it affects all of these issues transcend borders. They are not confined to the borders of any one particular country anywhere in the world. And so lots of countries are being very much interested in how do you deal with these kinds of things. And then policy options, whoops. Basically, again, you know, this is from Potter. Should we stay or should we go? What should be the future of our bases? Should we renew the Iran deal? These kinds of things. And then finally, last slide. I took a little bit more time than I wanted. These are the questions at the end of the reading, the great decisions questions. So it's 8:05, so we have till 8:30. That leaves about 25 minutes for questions. So I will stop there and see what you guys have to say. I think I'll leave this up for now in case anybody wants to refer to anything.
Okay, thank you, Pierre. So I'm going to moderate the questions. So if you have a question, please send it directly to me and I will read it. Or if you prefer to ask the question yourself, I'll call on you to ask the question. That way we can sort of stay somewhat organized with this. I have one question to kind of kick us off. This kind of goes back to US policy here. What do we actually gain by continuing to be in the Middle East and be the kind of the policeman of the Middle East? If we don't really need the oil, and as we look forward to all these countries projecting that by 2030, we're going to have a lot more electric cars, the reduction in the consumption of oil. So, you know, what impact is that going to have on the importance of the Middle East?
Great question. There are a couple of answers. One point is even as the United States becomes less dependent on oil, and even as the United States moves in the direction of greater alternative energies, the global economy is still largely running on oil. And so the price the United States from Asia and elsewhere comes on tankers, container ships. Those are all powered by oil. So the global economy is going to still be affected by oil for a very long time. I would say well past 2030. And so therefore, the United States as a global power, the United States as being very much impacted by globalization, we do care about this. Now, to what extent are we willing to spend our treasure, both financial and otherwise, in protecting it? That raises, you know, that's a very legitimate question. That's obviously the debate that's been going on, that's raised here as well. Can we maybe lead to create some sort of alliances or something where the United States can reduce its footprint? Do we need to have the Fifth Fleet in the Persian Gulf? That would be one particular question. We have a lot of forward basing now, where we basically have stockpiles of equipment in various countries, but no troops. So the idea, if there's an emergency, we can get the troops over there very quickly, and the equipment is already there, so we can do something. So that there are potentials of actually sort of withdrawing a little bit. What I think is clear is that none of the other major powers want to step in and fill a void that we would leave. Nobody wants to send a fleet into the Persian Gulf and be there. They don't have the capacity. No country in the world has the military capacity of the United States to have a two-ocean navy to basically be everywhere in the world. We have military basing in over 100 countries. There's no other country in the world that does that. So we have a footprint that nobody else has. The question is, and this is, I mean, curious to what people think. I mean, you know, to what extent do we want to keep doing this? My opinion on this is one person's opinion. I think it is in our strategic interest, but we certainly can look into ways of backing out a little bit as we become less dependent on oil, as the world becomes less dependent on oil. And I will say that a lot of the Gulf states themselves also see the writing on the wall, and they are diversifying their economy. They're trying to come up with other alternative ways of generating electricity and also of ways to generate revenue for their states.
Okay, thank you. Question going back to the relationship between Bahrain and UAE and Israel. Is this in the long run going to be positive, or there appear to be incentives or disincentives for other countries to follow suit?
I think it's, first of all, let me say, I've, you know, in previous talks, I mean, and even a little bit tonight, I've been very critical of Trump's foreign policy, but I think that the normalization agreements, even though I believe that he doesn't deserve all the credit, that's a real feather in the cap of the Trump administration. And I'm really surprised that, given everything else, I mean, you would think that as he was walking out the door, he would have been touting this as one of the great achievements. I mean, if you think about it, the last treaty The last formal diplomatic relationship Israel formed with any Arab country was in 1994 with Jordan. I mean, they only had two, Egypt in 79 and Jordan in 1994, and then nothing until 2020, basically 2019, 2020, with these four more Arab countries. I think it will lead to more. What's really interesting, and I sort of mentioned it in a line on the slide, but I went through it very quickly, was one of the significant things was Bahrain and UAE and Morocco and Sudan were willing to normalize relations with Israel to varying extents. The relations were different, without linking it to the Palestinian issue. In the past, it was always, resolve the Palestinian issue, and then there'll be good relations with Israel. And that was basically the whole idea of the Saudi peace plan of 2002, which basically said if Israel withdraws to the 67 lines, maybe with minor adjustments, and allows for a Palestinian state, the entire Arab world would recognize Israel. The Saudis proposed that in 2002. Netanyahu rejected it. But what's interesting was the Palestinian issue had to be resolved first. What's happened all these years later is basically the Palestinian issue has been dropped off the radar. And what that shows is just how much these actors are acting out of their state interests. UAE is much more concerned about Iran than it is about caring for the Palestinians. The same thing with Bahrain. Saudi Arabia and Israel see Iran as their fundamental foe, the enemy of my enemy, or what we call a checkerboard alliance. It's a balance of power kind of thing. And this has all been playing into it. I think that as more countries normalize with Israel, it's going to be easier for more additional countries to normalize with Israel. Maybe one day, once MBS becomes king, possibly, you might actually have an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel to normalize relations. What's interesting is now, if the Palestinian situation gets considerably worse than it already is, potentially that could undermine some of these agreements, because part of the agreements are they're supposed to do something, but there's really no linkage. So we'll sort of see what happens, but that's part of it. But surprisingly, it's really for the first time we've seen normalization with Israel where the Palestinian issue is not really on the front burner, and its states are acting out of their strategic interests, out of their common interests.
Thank you. Claire, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes. Looking at the book there near the end of the chapter, it said that eventually a post-oil era will arrive in the Gulf and the leadership must be ready for it.
Mm-hmm.
And it says that already Bahrain, Yemen, and Oman are post-oil. What does that mean, and why Bahrain, Yemen, and Oman?
Well, for Bahrain, I don't know too much about Oman and Yemen. I mean, really, I'll be honest with you. Most of my knowledge about Yemen is dealing more with the conflict and not the economic development. But what's happening is you have a lot of not just diversification of the economy, but building more of a service sector. So it's no longer the economy is no longer based on just revenue is not just based on extraction of natural resources, but a lot of service sector, a lot of corporate headquarters, a lot of trade, port type things, that type of stuff. So it's so that you're getting revenue from a lot of areas, not just oil, and not just petroleum in general. So that's where they're going. The UAE also is moving in a lot of you have a lot of corporations are set there. Tourism is actually becoming an issue, a source of revenue as well. So you have a lot of different kinds of things where rather than an economy where much of the revenue is based on primary resource extraction like oil, they're moving towards more services, financial services, construction, other kinds of sources of revenue, ports, trade, things like that.
Okay, thanks. Larry, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure, I will. You may have addressed this a little bit already, Pierre, but by saying that Israel's just not talking about the Palestinian question, but have they completely withdrawn from the two-state solution? Does the U.S. care about that anymore? And do you think that Biden will reverse the direction that U.S. is going in pushing towards the two-state solution? And who? I mean, just along the same line, why did we need to move the embassy to Jerusalem? And who was Trump and his administration trying to appease by doing that?
Okay, so let me work backwards because that's the one I remember you asking most recently. But those are all good questions. So there's actually an act of Congress, I believe, that was passed around 1995 that actually called for the embassy to be moved to Jerusalem. But it also gave the president the ability to hold off on moving so long as he believed the time wasn't right. And so every president, Clinton and then Bush and then Obama all declined to move to basically follow that act of Congress, using the exit clause, basically saying that they don't want to do it. The official position of the United States until Trump was that that any move of the embassy would come after negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians about the future of Jerusalem. And the embassy move was sort of dangling from Clinton and George W. Bush and Obama as sort of a carrot that, as a reward for if a two-state solution is reached, if an agreement is reached on Jerusalem, some sort of mutual thing, the reward will be the United States moving its embassy to Jerusalem. Trump unilaterally moved the embassy to Jerusalem without even asking anything from Israel in exchange. Just did it. And in part because why did he do it? Well, a very large, I think domestic politics played an important role. A very large contingent of the Republican Party are Christian Zionists, are Christian, very pro-Israel evangelical Christians. Most American Jews vote Democratic. There's a small percentage of American Jews who vote Republican, but he was not going to get a lot. And maybe he was thinking he might be able to get more American Jews to support him as well. But largely it was to satisfy the demands of domestically, the domestic aspect, to satisfy the demands of Christian evangelical pro-Israel people in the Republican Party. In addition to that, he also had a very positive relationship with Netanyahu. He wanted to show that he much more pro-Israel than anybody else. I personally think that one way to sort of understand a lot of Trump's foreign policy in a lot of different areas around the world was, if Obama did it, I'm going to do the opposite. Whatever Obama did, I will reverse. I think that was a deliberate, including domestic policy. I think it was actually a calculus that he was doing. And that also, meant, Obama had a very, very tense personal relationship with Netanyahu. They did not like each other at all. And so he sort of reversed that. He didn't just move the embassy to Jerusalem. As I mentioned earlier, he also unilaterally recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which is a very big deal because the Golan Heights were captured from Syria. Now, most Israelis will never want to give the Golan Heights back. It's of strategic significance. Israelis live there now. I mean, it's a huge thing. But for the United States to actually overturn American foreign policy from 1967 onward, again, with no concession. I mean, we didn't say, Israel, do something and we'll give you the Golan Heights. No, we basically said we were recognizing it. So Trump, the deal maker, was basically handing these gifts to Netanyahu. Potentially for one thing would be domestic reasons for the in the Republican Party, other factors as well, I think. But that's a large part of it. As for the two-state solution question, Netanyahu has no interest in a two-state solution, and the far right in Israel does not. Trump couldn't care less. And one of the things that Trump also did was, as soon as he came in, he also cut off all American funding to the Palestinians. He reduced our relationship with the Palestinians, and he basically took a totally 100% pro-Israel policy, whereas previous presidents, even Bush, who was very, very much more pro-Israel than Obama was, even Bush still maintained relations with the Palestinians. Trump basically changed all of that. So we have that. So one of the questions is there still a possibility for a two-state solution? We're going to see, first of all, on March 23rd, there's going to be the next Israeli elections. It's going to be the fourth election in 2 years because the governments keep collapsing. It's very politically unstable in the sense that they can't form a coalition government. So we'll see what happens, who ends up winning, who ends up being the coalition. If it's another center-right, far-right coalition led by Netanyahu and the far-right parties, you're not going to have any interest in a two-state solution whatsoever. If it's more centrist, you might have more of a difference. So we'll see what happens there. I do think that Biden is going to try and alter that, but how much capital does Biden want to invest in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? I don't imagine there's going to be a lot. I mean, I think he's much more interested in the Iran question and the nuclear deal and things like that. He will support the two-state solution, but is he going to really push Israel? I don't know. It's too early to tell at this point. But definitely, he's going to be much more nuanced than Trump. But what's interesting, on my last point on this, before I move to the next question, Biden is not doing what Trump did. And also, he's not doing what kind of Obama did when he came in after Bush. When Obama came in after Bush, Obama really wanted to correct what he saw were a lot of the mistakes that Bush made in the Middle East. So he reversed several things. When Trump came in, Trump wanted to undo everything that Obama did. Biden has not come in with the attitude, I'm going to undo everything that Trump did. So it was very clear. Blinken, the new Secretary of State, in his very first interview on CNN, said flat out, we're not moving the embassy back. That's sort of a done deal, right? That's not going to happen. He even raised questions about whether, are we going to pull back the recognition of the Golan Heights? We'll see. So there isn't this automatic kind of knee jerk, we're going to undo whatever Trump did. So that's an interesting thing. So Biden's taking a much more nuanced kind of cautionary approach, I think, than what Obama did and what Trump did.
To follow up a little bit on that, the movement of the embassy, and I think it was obvious that this was something for the evangelical supporters that he has.
Yeah.
But I haven't heard a clear reason, and maybe you or someone else who is on this program could explain why it is that the evangelicals wanted that to happen, because it was very clearly going to be extremely antagonistic to the Palestinians. And so was that the intention, just to antagonize the Palestinians to create more conflict in the Middle East? Or what's the end game there? And what really is the intention of that?
So I don't want to, all groups of people are not monolithic. So I don't want to say all evangelical Christians think the same way, right? But there's definitely some streams of thought among evangelicals that the end game is the end times. Mm-hmm. And the idea of that, that in order for the rapture, the second coming rapture to take place, there has to be the ingathering of all the Jews in the land of Israel. And that when that happens, then you'll have the rapture, and then Jews, frankly, will either accept Christ or they'll be burned alive. And when the second coming comes, there are people who want to see Armageddon take place. I'm not, and I don't want to say that all evangelicals think it, but there are definitely some kind of very kind of hardcore theological thinking that makes that argument. So therefore, you have had, for that and other reasons, you have had some American evangelicals that have actually taken more hardcore, hardline positions on Israel and the territories than most Israelis take. And so they've actually pushed, there were times when they were pushing Netanyahu to do more than he even wanted to do against the Palestinians. And so there is a sense of, I think, as a Jew myself, there are a lot of people who look at this and say, kind of with friends like these, ultimately, what is the end game? Do they really care about the safety and security of the Jewish state of Israel, or do they have some other ultimate goal in mind? And I think that's a legitimate question to ask. A lot of pro-Israel people are saying we don't really care what their ultimate goal is. They're supporting Israel, and Israel doesn't have that many supporters, so we'll take your support. There's actually a dialogue within the Jewish community about this, about what is the best way. How do you deal with people who perhaps may ultimately want to see the end of you, but they're supporting everything that Israel is doing. So, and again, I don't want to say all evangelicals like that. That's not true. Others are just very strongly Judeophile, and they firmly believe, because of their knowledge of the Old Testament, there's a natural affinity with the Jewish people. They see Israel as the Jewish state, and so of course it's the Jewish state, or they have a literal interpretation of the Bible. This is the land that was promised to the Jews by God, so it shouldn't go to the Palestinians. And there are a lot of Israelis who have that attitude as well. So it isn't necessarily, I don't want to say, some people are the end times and the rapture and all that kind of stuff. Others are, it's just out of genuine affinity for the Jewish people, and they see it as a Jewish state, or they believe it is truly land promised to them by God. And of course, the Holy Land of Israel happens to be in the West Bank, right? That's the actual Holy Land. It's not the Mediterranean coast. It's not Tel Aviv. It's Jerusalem. It's Hebron. It's these places that's where the true Holy Land is. And so this is Judea and Samaria. So that's where a lot of this all sort of comes in. And so so Trump was able to tap into or to reward some of his hardcore supporters. For them, this is a critical issue, moving the embassy, not allowing for a two-state solution, all those kinds of things. So that's part of it.
Thank you. That's great.
Just kind of a follow-up on the relationship between various presidential administrations. Do the changes that occur, every 4 years or 8 years, do they impact our security? Or, what kind of outcomes happen, when presidents change their policies towards the Middle East?
Well, that's a great question. One thing I say in my classes is that leaders matter. It actually does make a difference who's in charge, especially in critical moments in time. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, imagine if, and I can do counterfactuals, which are like, it's sort of like the what ifs of history. Imagine if Al Gore had become president in 2000 instead of George W. Bush. 9/11 most likely still would have happened, but would Al Gore have made the decision to go into Iraq after Afghanistan? Probably not. So who was president? I think George W. Bush had a lot of very specific reasons for why he wanted to go into Iraq, including the fact that his father had not finished the job, a lot of other kinds of things. Who is in power makes a very big difference. Had Hillary Clinton been president instead of Donald Trump, would our foreign policy be different? Absolutely. Had Romney won instead of Obama in 2012, we would have had some differences. Maybe not as radical of a shift, but clearly the leaders matter. And the vision that the leader has about what America's role in the world matters. During the Cold War, you had a fairly consistent across Democrats and Republicans from 1947 to about the mid-1960s. You had what we call the Cold War consensus. Democrats and Republicans pretty much were in agreement that we had to contain the Soviet Union. There were differences about how you go about doing that, but there was a general strategy, a strategic vision. After the end of the Cold War, we didn't really have a strategic vision. Then we get 9/11. Then it's largely, for a long time, it's the global war on terror. That changes with Obama, who wants to try and do different things. I think Obama was because of Bush, Obama was very gun shy and was very hesitant to use power in some places where maybe we should have used power, like perhaps in Syria in the beginning, and those kinds of things. And then Trump comes in and wants to sort of undo everything that, so we do get that. And what's actually been happening in recent transitions, more so than in the past, is I think that the domestic partisanship, the domestic polarization in American politics and the domestic partisan divide is actually impacting more on foreign policy than it used to. Because now you have these very, very, committed leaders coming in, strongly supported by their side, less willing to work with the other side, and now they're also in charge of foreign policy. And so I think as we're moving forward, it could actually become more unstable. It's going to be more unreliable. And I think that unreliability, starting with Obama and then getting worse with Trump. But Obama also, from the Saudis' perspective, Obama abandoning Mubarak in Egypt, the Saudis were incredibly livid over that. The Saudis hated Obama, and so did the Israelis didn't like Obama either. And so Obama's policies actually brought, with Iran as a common foe, brought Israel and Saudi Arabia closer together. Then comes Trump, who throws all these presents to Israel and Saudi Arabia. That's great, but what he also does is he basically is unpredictable. It's clear he doesn't want to have anybody's back. And so this sense of insecurity and unpredictability coming out of the American administration forces a lot of regional players to start forming their own foreign policies, to start thinking about different kinds of alliances. Netanyahu starts getting closer to Russia, for example. You have all these, the opening opportunities for various players. That is all happening in part, not only, but in part because of the uncertainty that is coming out of American foreign policy. And I think part of that is a reflection of the domestic polarization. Other things as well. Also, we're less wary. We don't want to, Americans are not on the same page on anything right now, let alone foreign policy, let alone having a larger military presence in the Gulf or something like that. So I hope that answers your question, but that's sort of like a various takes on.
Well, it's complicated.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, definitely. Everything is.
So it's 8:30. Betty, do you want to kind of give us some rules of the game here? There's a couple of more questions, but maybe we can save those for a little discussion afterwards. So.
Well, I was just wondering the same thing. If that person will stay with us, I'd appreciate that, because I think there's two here, and and it could take a little bit of time. And we did promise. Eric, can you stay with us, Eric Johnson, afterward and join us for a little bit?
And Kimberly Robertson also had a question too, so she.
Okay, if you would, what would you like to do, Ray?
Well, I think since we did promise to kind of take a
Okay,
2-minute break here, and then we'll get back together for more casual discussion.
please, yeah, please do stay. And if you will stay, the two people who've got questions, we'll address your questions straight away. And this is where we're going to launch now up into our nightcap. I'm going to my lager to get a glass of wine. And Pierre, we invite you to do the same, or beer or whatever it is you like to get. And we'll just give a couple of minutes for those of you who'd like to do that. And we're going to come right back. We really do hope you stay with us, because we think that even though it's not the same as being together, we think that we can assimilate and it will be informal. It will be informal. We would like to have Pierre maybe answer those questions, but it's going to be a discussion. I have a very silly question I'd like to ask Pierre, and I thought, well, I'm going to wait till I have a glass of wine and blame it on
Me too.
during this serious Q&A time. So please go grab something to drink and be right back with us, please. If you have to leave, then we do understand. Next week, by the way, on Wednesday, thank you, Claire. Let me just say very quickly, we have a very engaging program with distinguished speakers, Diplomacy Through Sports. Let me find it here. I had it. Diplomacy Through Sports, the globalization of sports and societal change. We have some very interesting speakers. We have a panel. It's going to be a panel. And again, because of virtual, we're bringing these are all professional speakers who know what they are talking about, represent either the world of professional sports or also someone from the U.S. Department of State, sports specialist. It's going to be very exciting. And then in 2 weeks from tonight, we'll be back with Frank O'Donnell, who hails from Ireland, but also lives in Europe. We're going to talk about globalization. That's going to be very interesting. Now go to your lager. We'll be right back.
So Ken, you had kind of an interesting question too. I didn't get to about the